My boss sneered, "You're replaceable." I smiled and said nothing. 6 months later, he was sitting across from me in a job interview. The resume in my hands was warm from the printer. That's the detail I keep coming back to. The paper was still warm, like it had just been born, and I was sitting behind my desk reading the name at the top and trying to decide if what I was feeling was justice or something older and less clean than that. Renwick Director of Strategic Operations. Former Director of Strategic Operations. 8 bullet points of accomplishments that I recognized, because I had written 6 of them. His proposed salary, $190,000, which was $40,000 more than I'd ever been paid to do the job he was now applying to have me give him. My assistant knocked and cracked the door. "Your 2 o'clock is in the lobby. Send him up," I said. I set the resume down. I straightened it so the edges were parallel to the edge of the desk. I put my hands flat on the surface and looked out the window at a city that had no idea what was about to happen in this room. Then I smiled, because I couldn't help it. Because 18 months ago, I had sat in a chair exactly like the one outside my door, in a building exactly like this one, and listened to Renwick tell me that I was replaceable. He wasn't wrong. He just didn't specify who would be replacing whom. Part 1. The education of Sable Van. I'd been at Creston Meridian Consulting for 4 years and 11 months when the word replaceable entered my life. My name is Sable Van. People sometimes comment on it. It's the color of fur, the word for absence of light. And I usually just nod, because the alternative is explaining that my mother was a poet who believed names should mean something, which opens a longer conversation than most situations call for. I was 31 when I joined Creston Meridian as a mid-level analyst in the Strategic Advisory Division. The pitch was good: fast-growing regional consultancy, genuine upward mobility, meritocratic culture. I'd left a larger firm to take it, which felt reckless at the time and correct within the first year, because the work was real and the team was excellent and I was honestly thriving. Then Renwick arrived. He came in as a lateral hire 18 months into my tenure, brought in from a competitor to head the division I'd been quietly building a case to lead myself. I want to be fair. The decision wasn't irrational. Renwick had 15 years of experience to my 4, a track record at a firm 3 times our size, and the particular energy of a man who had learned very early how to make authority look effortless. He was 53, silver at the temples, had a firm handshake, and a laugh that arrived exactly when laughs were socially expected to arrive. He was also, I would come to understand over the following 3 years, one of those people who knew how to take credit with the same fluency that other people knew how to take notes. The first time I noticed, it was subtle enough that I let it go. We'd spent 6 weeks on a client restructuring analysis, myself and a junior analyst named Doriel Okafor, who was 24 and had a mind like a steel trap, and the patience of someone who has been underestimated so many times they've developed a kind of philosophical acceptance of it. Doriel and I built the whole model: the data polls, the scenario analysis, the sensitivity tables, the executive summary. Renwick attended 2 of our 8 working sessions and contributed what I would describe as ambient enthusiasm. The client presentation went well. The room was engaged. The CEO asked specific questions about the methodology. Renwick answered them all, fluently, with the confidence of someone who had spent weeks on it. Afterward, in the elevator, he clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Great support work. Support work." I said thank you. Because what else do you say in an elevator? Doriel caught my eye and looked away. Part 2. The escalation you keep explaining away. The second time, it was a pitch deck. I'd been asked by our managing partner, a woman named Thessaly Bright, 22 years in consulting, who had the focused directness of someone who had run out of patience for everything except results, to develop a competitive positioning deck for a new healthcare sector client. This was, in the language of our firm, a growth opportunity, the kind of project that became a case study, the kind of case study that became a career. I spent 3 weeks on it, nights and a weekend. Doriel helped with the data architecture. I did the narrative. Renwick reviewed it the day before the pitch. He made 11 edits, most of them cosmetic, a word swapped here, a slide reordered there. Standard senior review. He presented it alone. I wasn't in the room. I'd been told 40 minutes before the meeting that the client had space constraints, and the team was being trimmed to just the lead. We won the engagement. Renwick sent an all-team email that said, "Great collaborative effort, everyone." I forwarded the original file to myself that evening, the version with my name in the document properties, my revision history, my 217 comments. I didn't know why I did it. Some instinct. Some part of me that had been paying attention even when the rest of me was busy explaining things away. The third time, it involved money. Creston Meridian had a performance bonus structure tied to client origination and project revenue. I'd been the analytical lead on 7 engagements in the prior 12 months, 3 of which were new clients that I had personally been involved in pitching. My bonus that year was $14,000. The average for my level was $22,000. When I asked HR discreetly through a form rather than a direct conversation about the methodology, I received a response from a coordinator named Fletch Aurelio, 3 years in HR, which said only that bonuses were determined by team performance metrics as assessed by division leadership. Division leadership was Renwick. My hands were completely steady when I read that email. I've thought about that since. I think I was past the stage where things surprised me. I had arrived, without realizing it, at a colder and more useful emotional register. The 4th time was the performance review. Renwick sat across from me in a glass-walled conference room with a view of the parking structure and read from a printed sheet. The review was, he said, mixed. mixed. I had strong technical output, but struggled with executive presence. I needed to work on owning the room. My client communication was occasionally too detailed for senior stakeholders. I want to be precise. He said this to me specifically. The person who had, 12 days earlier, received an unsolicited email from the CFO of one of our healthcare clients. I have the email, I kept everything, saying my analysis had been the clearest and most actionable work we've received from any consulting partner in 5 years. I asked Renwick if I could see the documented basis for the executive presence assessment. He smiled. It's a qualitative measure, Sable. That's the nature of it. Right, I said. You're talented, he said, which in my experience is what people say right before they say the thing they actually mean. But, I said, but in this division, at this level, everyone is talented. You need to understand that from my chair, the view is different. I have to think about the team as a whole. He leaned back. Honestly, you're replaceable. That's not a knock. It's the reality of consulting at scale. The sooner you accept that, the better you'll do. Replaceable. He said it the way you'd say it's raining or the market's up. A fact. A neutral fact about the weather of my career. I looked at him for 2 full seconds. I've reconstructed that moment so many times that I'm not sure anymore what I actually felt versus what I've assigned in retrospect. I think it was something like, oh, okay, now I know exactly what this is. I smiled. I said, thanks for the feedback. I went back to my desk. I opened my laptop, and I began, very quietly, to build the thing that would take 18 months and completely rearrange both our lives. Part 3. What I did. Instead of quitting, I did not quit. That matters, so I'll say it clearly. I did not quit. I did not escalate. I did not go to HR with a discrimination complaint I couldn't yet document. I did something that felt, at the time, very small. I started writing things down. Every meeting, every project, every email I sent that generated a client response, every slide I built, every model I ran, every analysis that made it into a deliverable. Date, time, my contribution, the output, the credit distribution. I kept it in a Google Doc I titled Professional Development Notes, which was so boring as a file name that it was essentially invisible. I also started talking to Thessaly Bright, not about Renwick, not directly, not yet. I started attending the optional strategy sessions she ran for senior analysts, the ones that happened at 7:30 a.m. and were attended by approximately 6 people who were either ambitious or insomniacs. I brought observations. I brought questions that were actually positions. I made myself gradually and deliberately legible to the person who had the ability to see what Renwick had been obscuring. Thessaly Bright, I should say, was not easily manipulated and did not suffer performances. She had spent 22 years in an industry that rewarded the appearance of competence over its substance, which meant she had developed a very finely calibrated sensor for the gap between the two. The 3rd time I attended her session, she looked at me across the table and said, "You were on the Harwick healthcare pitch, weren't you?" "I built the model," I said. "I know," she said, and moved on. She knew. I also, during this period, began an extraordinarily careful documentation process with the help of 2 people outside the firm. The first was my personal attorney, a woman named Cressida Mock, who specialized in employment law and had, she told me in our first meeting, handled 31 cases involving credit theft and wage suppression in professional services environments. She reviewed my documentation. She told me what was actionable and what wasn't. She helped me understand the difference between a grievance and a case. "Right now," she said in February, "you have a grievance. Keep building." The second was a career consultant named Aldrich Farr, who had spent 15 years as a managing partner at a global firm before leaving to work with executives in transition. Doriel had found him. Doriel, who had quit Creston Meridian in January, as she put it, before I do something I can't undo, and who had stayed in close contact with me because she was constitutionally unable to let an injustice fully go. Aldrich helped me do something I hadn't considered doing yet. He helped me build a market case for myself, not a resume, a market case. The distinction matters. A resume is a document. A market case is an argument, a structured, evidence-based narrative about what specific value a specific person has generated, documented, verifiable, told in the language of outcomes rather than responsibilities. We spent 6 weeks building mine. Aldrich said when we were done, "I've seen partners at top 10 firms with thinner cases than this." I was still, at this point, employed at Creston Meridian, eating lunch at my desk, attending Renwick's Monday All Hands, and saying thanks for the feedback with a consistency that I'm honestly a little proud of. Part 4, the crisis I did not see coming. I need to tell you about March. I had been expecting to outlast Renwick through attrition, the slow accumulation of evidence, the gradual shift in Thessaly's perception, the inevitable moment when the gap between what he claimed and what he'd actually built became too wide to paper over. I had not anticipated that Renwick would accelerate the timeline himself. In March, Creston Meridian landed the largest engagement in the firm's history, a full operational review for a regional hospital network, 18 months of work, $4.2 million in fees. The kind of engagement that reshapes a firm's trajectory, the kind of work that makes careers. Renwick announced at the Monday All Hands that he would be leading the engagement personally, supported by a team he would hand-select for excellence. I was not on the list he read out. 7 names, not mine. I sat very still. I felt my jaw tighten, physically, like something clicking into a locked position, and I breathed through it. After the meeting, Renwick found me in the kitchen. He had the look of a man who had prepared for this conversation. "I know you were probably hoping to be involved," he said. I was, I said. The client specifically requested senior-only staffing. I'm sure you understand. The client that I had helped pitch. The client whose CFO had emailed me directly. Of course, I said. There'll be other opportunities. I smiled. I nodded. I poured my coffee. That afternoon, I sent an email to Aldrich for, I think it's time. 3 days later, I had my first conversation with Harwick Healthcare's chief of staff, a man named Overton Lask, who had spent 12 years in operational consulting before moving client-side, and who had, it turned out, been wondering for 6 months why the analyst behind the Harwick engagement hadn't called. Your name, he said in that first call, kept coming up internally whenever we referenced that work. We assumed you were being lined up for something big at your firm. Not exactly, I said. He said. In April, I had coffee with Harwick's chief strategy officer. In May, Harwick Healthcare's board approved the creation of a new internal strategy function, Director of Strategic Operations, a role built to translate external consulting frameworks into sustainable internal capability. Salary, $190,000 plus equity participation. They asked if I knew anyone who might be interested. I said I might. On May 14th, I gave Creston Meridian 4 weeks' notice. Renwick took the meeting himself. He sat across from me in the same glass-walled conference room with the view of the parking structure and asked, with what I think was genuine surprise, why I was leaving. An opportunity came up, I said. Where? I told him. He blinked. Just once, but it was the kind of blink that contains a whole recalculation. Harwick reached out to you directly? We had a relationship, I said. He nodded slowly. He said the firm would miss me. He said all the things you say. He walked me out to the elevator, which I thought was a strange gesture. And then he said, and this is the part I have replayed more than I should. He said, you know, I always knew you had more in you than you showed here. The elevator opened. I stepped in. I said, I know you did, Renwick. Part 5, the building of something real. I started at Harwick Healthcare on June 3rd. I want to be clear about something. The job was hard. The job was genuinely, consistently, take your breath away hard. Building an internal strategy function from scratch inside a 4,800-person healthcare organization is not a revenge fantasy. It's a project management nightmare with clinical compliance implications and 7 layers of stakeholder politics. I worked longer hours than I had at Creston Meridian. I made mistakes. I hired wrong once and had to fix it. I sat in rooms where people were openly skeptical of the entire concept of an internal strategy function and had to make the case from scratch every time, without the credibility scaffolding of a firm name behind me. But it was mine. The work was mine in a way that nothing at Creston Meridian had ever been. When I presented to the board in September, there was no one else in the room whose name was in the document properties. Overton Lask became, over those first months, something between a mentor and a collaborator. He had the particular gift of people who have done hard things. He didn't minimize difficulty. He just refused to treat it as an obstacle to forward motion. Fix it, or document why you can't, he'd say, which sounds harsh and is actually the most useful management philosophy I've encountered. By October, the function was real. 3 staff, a roadmap, 2 completed analyses that the CFO had taken into board-level conversations. We were producing value that was visible, attributable, and mine. And then, in November, we needed to expand. The board approved 2 additional senior hires. Overton and I wrote the job descriptions together. We posted to the usual channels, engaged a recruiter, a woman named Petra Vaughn, 20 years in healthcare executive search, no-nonsense, efficient, and began reviewing applications in December. The first week of December, Petra emailed me a short list of 12 candidates. I was on a call when it came in. I finished the call, opened the email, opened the attached document, and scrolled through the names. The 4th name. My hand stopped moving the mouse. I looked at the name for a long moment. I looked at the 8 bullet points beneath it. I recognized 6 of them because I had written them. They were from the Harwick Healthcare pitch, the analysis I had built, the methodology I had explained, his bullets, my work. Renwick Solbe, former Director of Strategic Operations, Creston Meridian Consulting, former. I looked that word up later because I'm that kind of person. Former, having previously been a particular thing. He had left Creston Meridian, or been asked to leave. The timeline when I checked LinkedIn that evening suggested September, 3 months after my departure. The Harwick engagement, the one he'd hand-selected his team for, had apparently encountered scope realignment. The firm's public statements were careful. Doriel, who still had contacts there, was less careful. The client had asked for a team change in July. The engagement had been restructured. Renwick's position had been eliminated in a reorganization. Gone. Just like that. And now he was on my shortlist. I sat with that for a full evening. I want to be honest. There was a version of me that wanted to simply decline him without a meeting, to close the loop quietly, to never put either of us through the particular discomfort of that room. It would have been clean. It would have been invisible. No one would have known. But Petra had vetted him as qualified. He was, technically, qualified, and I had built this function on the principle that the work was what mattered, not the politics, not the history, not the noise around the edges of the actual job. So I scheduled the interview. I did not tell Overton who Renwick was to me. I told him only that I wanted to conduct the first round interviews myself, solo, which was within my authority, and which Overton noted without comment. He trusted my judgment. That trust was not something I was going to compromise for the satisfaction of having a witness. Part 6. The room. December 14th, 2 p.m. The resume on my desk was warm from the printer. I heard him before I saw him, his voice in the lobby, the particular cadence of of a man managing his presentation, the laugh that arrived exactly when laughs were expected to arrive. My assistant, Bram Oleska, showed him back at 2:03, 3 minutes late. Bram, who had the expressionless efficiency of someone who cataloged everything and said nothing, met my eyes for half a second on his way out. Renwick Solby walked into my office and saw me. I have thought about that moment from every angle. I have tried to describe it accurately, which means resisting the temptation to make it more dramatic than it was. He didn't freeze. He didn't go white. He was good. He was genuinely good at the performance of composure. And so what happened was subtler than a freeze. It was a micro-adjustment, a half-second recalibration, visible only to someone who had spent nearly 5 years watching his face in meetings. He knew. Sable, he said. Renwick, I said. Have a seat. He sat. He set his portfolio on the corner of his knee. He was wearing a good suit, slightly better than his Creston Meridian suits, actually. The kind of upgrade a person makes when they're trying to project stability after losing it. I noticed that. I didn't realize, he started. We can acknowledge it or not, I said. Either works for me, but I want to be clear that this is a real interview for a real position, and I intend to conduct it as such. He looked at me for a moment. Something moved across his face that I couldn't fully name. Not shame. Shame requires a kind of self-awareness that I don't think Renwick had cultivated. Something more like recalibration, a reassignment of categories. Of course, he said. Thank you. I asked him about his experience with internal strategy function design. He answered well. He had relevant experience genuinely from his years before Creston Meridian. I asked him about stakeholder management in clinical environments. He spoke about a hospital engagement from 2019 that he'd led directly. The answer was good. I asked him about the Harwick healthcare engagement. He paused, just briefly. That was a complex project. It was, I said. What was your contribution to the original pitch framework? Another pause. The question was a surgical instrument, and we both knew it. He could claim the work, the 6 bullets on his resume, the methodology, the model, and we would both know he was lying. Or he could be honest, in which case he was undercutting his own application. He chose a third option I hadn't fully anticipated. He looked at me steadily and said, I presented it. I didn't build it. The room was very quiet. I know, I said. We sat with that for a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3. The position, I said, moving on, requires someone who can build from scratch, not present, not manage, build. I need to understand if that's genuinely in your toolkit, because the title at your prior role and the actual work may not have been aligned. He said quietly, they weren't always. It was the most honest thing I'd ever heard him say. Part 7. What happened after I did not hire Renwick Solby? I want to be clear about that, because the story could go a different way. The magnanimous reversal, the redemption arc, the circle completed. And I considered it, genuinely considered it. But the position required someone who led with building, not presenting. And Renwick's entire career architecture had been built around the latter. The honest answer he gave me in that room suggested self-awareness. But self-awareness isn't a skill set. I wrote my notes, filed them with Petra, and noted that the candidate had relevant senior experience, but a profile better suited to client-facing roles than internal build functions. Petra found someone else, a woman named Azara Finch, 37, who'd spent 4 years building a similar function inside a Midwest health system and who, in her first interview, spent 45 minutes explaining everything she'd gotten wrong and what she'd learned from it. I hired her in January. She's still one of the best decisions I've made. Renwick, from what Doriel told me later, landed a senior consulting role at a smaller firm in the spring. Lateral, not upward. He's competent. I've always said that. And competence finds its level. What I think about is the shape of the thing, the arc of it, how a single word, replaceable, delivered in a conference room with a view of a parking structure, became a kind of compass. Not because it hurt me, though it did, but because it clarified something I'd been circling without quite naming, the difference between a career that belongs to you and a career that belongs to whoever is standing between you and the person who can see you. Cressida Mock, my employment attorney, sent me a bottle of wine when I left Creston Meridian, with a note that said, you built the case, you won it clean. Aldrich Four, my career consultant, asked me a year later if I'd thought about what I'd do if I ever encountered Renwick again. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a long moment, then he said, what did you feel in that room? I thought about it honestly. Tired, I said, and grateful, in roughly equal measure. Grateful for what? That I hadn't quit, I said. That I'd stayed long enough to know what I was worth before I let anyone else tell me. Epilogue. 18 months later. My office has south-facing windows now. The light is completely different. Warm, direct, the kind that makes you squint at your screen in the afternoon and complain about it and secretly never want it to change. Doriel Okafor joined Harwick's strategy function in August. She reached out to me. I told her about the position. The work, I told her, was real and hard and hers. She started on the 23rd, and by day 3 had already found a flaw in one of our models that saved us from a significantly embarrassing board presentation. She got full credit, in writing, with her name in the document properties. The Creston Meridian all hands where Renwick told me I was replaceable. I've looked up the date. March 8th, a Tuesday, 9 hours a.m. Fluorescent lighting, the particular hum of a room that smells like recycled air and someone's breakfast. He was right, technically. I was replaceable at that firm, in that role, in that structure. Every person is replaceable inside a structure that was built to contain them. The thing he didn't account for was what I might build if I left the structure entirely. I think about that sometimes. times, sitting in the south-facing light, squinting at my screen. Replaceable. Sure, by the right person, in the right moment, everything is. The question is who does the replacing. If you made it this far, you already know what I'm going to say. She's not replaceable anymore. Neither are you.